March 1967, Hanoi, North Vietnam. The iron doors of Hoa Lo prison groaned open as a new group of American prisoners stumbled inside, blindfolded, beaten and exhausted. The guards called it Maison Centrale, but the men who would live and suffer there gave it another name, the Hanoi Hilton. The air was thick with the stench of mould and rot. Concrete walls trapped the heat and the screams. Rats scurried across the floor, feeding on what was left behind by the last man dragged out for interrogation. Each cell was a box. No windows, no sound, no mercy. The guards isolated every man deliberately, cutting off all communication. No voices, no hope. Only the drip of water, the shuffle of boots, and the click of a lock echoing down the corridor. To the captors, silence was the weapon. It stripped men of their humanity. It made them easier to control. For the newly captured pilots and soldiers, this was a different kind of battlefield. One fought not with rifles or bombs, but with the mind. The rules of survival changed overnight. You obeyed to avoid beatings. You resisted to stay human. And between those two was a razor's edge, where sanity lived or died. The guards rotated men between cells to prevent familiarity. They forced prisoners to sit motionless for hours facing the wall. They punished even glances exchanged through cracks in the doors. Days blurred into weeks. The heat suffocated and the loneliness gnawed at the edges of thought. It was here, in this void, that men began to break. Some wept silently, some prayed, some stopped speaking altogether. But somewhere, deep within those walls, a faint sound began. A single knock, then another. At first it was random, a nervous tick, a desperate attempt to remind oneself that someone else was alive. Then slowly, it became pattern. Deliberate. Controlled. The guards didn't notice at first. The concrete muffled the noise, and to them it was nothing but background hum, the building breathing in the heat. But to the men inside, it was the first heartbeat of resistance. For the prisoners, communication meant everything. It was defiance. It was hope. They had been cut off from the world, from each other, from command. Yet in the darkness, one idea began to take root. If they couldn't speak, they would find another way. They remembered old military training, scraps of history, codes used by downed pilots and captured soldiers. They began tapping sequences on the walls, not random, but structured. 5 taps, pause, then another 5. It was primitive, clumsy, and dangerous. But it was a beginning. Those who discovered the rhythm realized something incredible. Each tap represented a letter, each pause a separation. With patience, messages could move through stone. Slowly, painstakingly, the first words travelled from cell to cell. Names, ranks, fragments of courage. The first man to receive a message later said it was like hearing another heartbeat through the wall, a reminder that they were not alone. In a prison built to erase identity, the walls themselves became the lifeline. Each tap, each coded knock, was an act of rebellion against silence. It was proof that thought could not be confined, that even in captivity, the human spirit could find a voice. As the guards patrolled the corridors, listening for whispers, the real war had already begun, a silent war fought in code, echoing through concrete. The Hanoi Hilton had been built to contain men, but it would soon become the birthplace of one of the most extraordinary communication networks ever forged under captivity. A brotherhood held together not by sight or sound, but by rhythm, faith, and the will to survive. And it all started with a single, quiet tap in the dark. At first, the taps were chaos, random bursts of sound echoing through concrete. Some were too faint to hear, others too fast to follow. But among those lost beats, a pattern began to form. A code reborn from fragments of memory and desperation. The men who first devised it were trained pilots, survivors of the skies now imprisoned beneath the earth. They had studied old wartime tactics, remembered field manuals, and whispered through their memories until the pieces clicked together. Somewhere, someone remembered the ancient Polybius square, a system of numbers and letters used centuries earlier for secret writing. 5 rows, 5 columns, 25 letters, each one represented by 2 taps, one for the row, one for the column. A became 1 tap, then 1 more. B became 1, then 2. It was simple, elegant, and deadly effective. And in a place where words could get you beaten half to death, it was perfect. They practiced in silence, learning to listen for the rhythm, the difference between a tap for H and a tap for N. A mistake could mean confusion, a long pause could mean capture, but they learned, cell by cell, wall by wall, until the sound of tapping became the heartbeat of the prison. Messages moved slowly at first, fragments of reassurance, names of fellow captives, quiet statements of faith. Alive. Hold on. We will endure. In the Hanoi Hilton, those words were worth more than food or water. They were proof that resistance still lived. The walls carried those messages like veins through a body. Every cell was connected. A knock in one room echoed through another, then another, until the entire block pulsed with faint rhythm. The guards heard nothing. The prisoners heard everything. They began organising. The senior officers used the code to re-establish command, issuing orders, sharing intelligence, keeping men disciplined even under torture. The system spread across buildings, adapted for those too weak to tap. Some used coughs, others scraped metal on stone. The method changed, but the message never did. We are one. At night, the prison became a living organism of sound. Tiny bursts of rhythm flickered across the walls like sparks. Even the guards' footsteps became part of the symphony. Each step a signal to stop, each pause a cue to begin again. Sometimes the code carried jokes, small stories, or pieces of scripture. Sometimes it carried information about men who didn't come back from interrogation. Each message was a reminder that the war still existed beyond those walls, and that they were still soldiers, even in chains. But with every new success came greater risk. The guards began noticing patterns. They couldn't translate the sound, but they sensed disobedience. Punishments grew harsher. Men were dragged from their cells for making noise. Some were beaten unconscious. Others were left in solitary confinement, a coffin-sized cell where even breathing too loud drew blows. And yet the tapping never stopped. In the quiet after torture, when a man lay bleeding on the floor, he would hear it. Faint, steady, relentless. Tap, tap, tap. A message from someone still fighting, still alive. It was not just a code anymore. It was a language of defiance. A way to tell their captors, you can cage our bodies, but not our will. The North Vietnamese had built Hoa Lo to break men apart, to erase the unity of the American forces. Instead, the prisoners built something unbreakable, a communication network more powerful than radio, more secret than any spy cipher. The tap code became their invisible lifeline, their shield against despair. It bound them together in silence, carried orders through concrete, and built a chain of hope strong enough to outlast the walls themselves. What began as a few desperate knocks in the dark had become the most remarkable act of unity ever forged in captivity. And in the years to come, it would save lives, preserve sanity, and quietly rewrite the story of what it meant to resist. By 1969, the tap code had become the soul of the Hanoi Hilton. Every prisoner knew it, from the highest-ranking officers to the youngest pilots shot down weeks before. The sound of tapping was no longer strange. It was sacred. It was life. The code travelled like electricity through concrete, flowing cell to cell, building to building. A man could lie chained to the floor and still be part of something vast, unseen and alive. They were surrounded by stone, but somehow they had built a world within it. Communication in that prison wasn't luxury. It was survival. The mind needed purpose. Isolation drove men to madness, and words, even silent ones, could bring them back. A simple message like "God bless you" or "We're with you" could lift a man off the edge of despair. The tapping became ritual, a pulse, a connection stronger than the iron that held them. The network grew more organised with time. The senior officers became invisible commanders, sending orders through the walls as if running a hidden army. They passed news about captured comrades, interrogation schedules, even world events learned from brief glimpses of newspapers or whispers from new arrivals. Each letter took patience, 5 seconds to send, 10 to receive. A single sentence might take an hour, but time was the one thing they had. And in that slow rhythm, trust was born. Men who had never seen each other's faces became brothers. They shared memories, prayers, strategies, even humour. One prisoner once tapped out a joke about a guard's terrible singing. The response from 3 cells away came hours later. laughter in code, echoing faintly like music through stone. The walls that once imprisoned them now carried laughter, love, command, and hope. Even punishment couldn't erase it. When men were dragged to interrogation, their friends would wait in silence, listening for the returning signal. Sometimes, hours later, a single tap would answer, weak but clear. Still here. Some of the strongest men became teachers. They trained newcomers in the rhythm, drilling them in silence so no sound escaped beyond the walls. When a new pilot arrived, battered and terrified, he would be taught the first few letters of the grid. It often saved his sanity. The code gave him purpose again, a mission to master, a unit to belong to. The prisoners of war became living transmitters. A message could start in one cell block, bounce through 10 others, and arrive on the far side of the prison hours later. Orders from senior officers, like Admiral Stockdale and others, travelled entirely through tap sequences. The entire chain of command existed without paper, radio, or speech. The North Vietnamese guards never fully understood. They could hear faint noises but couldn't translate them. They searched the walls, accused the men of plotting, and punished them in blind rage. But the network was unstoppable, self-healing, invisible, indestructible. At night, when the guards slept and the corridors were still, the walls hummed softly with messages. Some spoke of home, some spoke of God, some simply said good night. The rhythm became part of them. Some prisoners tapped even in their sleep, their hands twitching with phantom messages. After years inside, the sound was as natural as breathing. In that small dark world, words weren't just communication, they were rebellion. Every letter spelled defiance, every phrase was proof that the human spirit could adapt to anything, even captivity. The tap code was more than noise. It was the sound of unity, echoing through cold stone, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. And though the men didn't know it yet, that faint sound, that rhythm born of suffering and courage, would one day outlast the prison itself. In a place designed to silence them forever, they had built something eternal, a brotherhood that could speak through concrete. The guards eventually began to notice. They couldn't understand the pattern, but they heard it, faint, rhythmic, persistent. At first they dismissed it as rats or plumbing, but rats didn't pause between syllables and pipes didn't laugh in the dark. Then one morning the beatings began. A prisoner was caught tapping on the wall with his knuckles. The guards stormed in, shouting in broken English. The man tried to play dumb, but they dragged him into the courtyard, stripped him to the waist and beat him until the ground ran dark. For the rest of that day, the prison was silent. That night, though, as the guards patrolled the corridors, a new sound emerged. Softer, slower. Tap, tap, tap. The same message repeated through the cell block. We will not stop. The guards went mad trying to hunt the source. They tore apart cells, inspected the walls, even transferred prisoners to break the chain. It didn't matter. The code was everywhere. Every man in the Hanoi Hilton knew that discovery meant pain. Torture wasn't theoretical, it was daily life. Prisoners were tied with ropes that cut through muscle, hung from rafters until they passed out, or locked in tiny concrete boxes too small to stand. The goal was simple, obedience through agony. But pain could only reach so far. Every time the guards punished one man, 10 others took his place. They learned to disguise the sound, tapping while cleaning, coughing in code, clicking spoons against tin bowls. Even the shuffle of feet became a form of speech. The captors called them criminals. The men called themselves soldiers. And soldiers communicated, no matter the risk. Some of the worst punishments came in the summer of 1969. The guards discovered that prisoners were using the tap code to maintain a chain of command. They singled out the senior officers and moved them to solitary confinement. Admiral Stockdale and other leaders were beaten, starved and locked in isolation cells barely larger than coffins. But isolation did not erase them. The others kept the chain alive through the walls. They used what they called the line, a route of communication that passed messages between cells even when entire blocks were separated. They tapped through plumbing, sent signals through sweeping brooms, even left coded scratches on buckets. When one man returned from torture, he could barely move. His ribs were broken, his face swollen. But that night, lying in the dark, he lifted one trembling hand and tapped 3 letters on the floor. GBU, God bless you. That single act spread through the prison like a spark in dry grass. The guards realised too late what they had created. Their brutality had not destroyed the network, it had hardened it. The tapping wasn't just a language anymore, it was a heartbeat of resistance. The walls that were meant to isolate had become a living organism of solidarity. By 1970, the system was so refined that it could move complex orders and intelligence through the entire prison in hours. The guards couldn't stop it. They could only listen, baffled, as invisible words passed right under their noses. And even when men were too weak to move, too broken to lift their hands, they would still communicate. A single scrape of a boot, a faint knock with a tin cup, a pause long enough for another man to hear and answer. The North Vietnamese had turned the Hanoi Hilton into a monument of suffering. The prisoners turned it into a cathedral of courage. They didn't have weapons, radios or freedom, but they had each other. And that, in the end, was stronger than any chain. Every tap was defiance. Every coded word was proof that no wall, no pain, no enemy could break the will of men who refused to be silenced. And when the guards listened close at night, they could still hear it. The faint, relentless rhythm of hope echoing through the dark. February 1973. After years of silence, the doors of Hoa Lo prison creaked open, not for punishment, but for release. The war was ending. Operation Homecoming had begun. The men who had endured the worst captivity of the Vietnam War were going home. But as they prepared to step beyond the walls, many realised something strange. They could still hear the tapping. Even with the doors open, the rhythm echoed in their minds like a second heartbeat. For years the sound had been their language, their lifeline, their rebellion. Now it was their memory, the proof that they had survived not by luck but by unity. When the first groups were escorted out into the sunlight, their eyes burned. Some had not seen daylight in nearly a decade. Faces were gaunt, movements careful. The air smelled of smoke and diesel, but to them it was freedom. Helicopters waited on the tarmac. Some men smiled for the first time in years, others wept. And as they boarded the aircraft, a few looked back at the prison walls, cracked, sun-bleached and still standing, and whispered goodbye. What the guards never understood was that those walls had been defeated long before the war ended. The prisoners had turned their captivity into something sacred. Through pain and silence, they had built an invisible network stronger than concrete, a brotherhood of rhythm, discipline and faith. When the POWs returned home, they brought the code with them. During debriefings, many still tapped unconsciously, messages in rhythm that only they could understand. At reunions years later, veterans of the Hanoi Hilton could communicate entire conversations with a few knocks on the table. The habit never died. It had become part of them, a mark of shared endurance, written not in ink, but in sound. The world called them heroes. They didn't see themselves that way. Most said they had simply done what was necessary to keep each other alive. But historians and psychologists would later call their code one of the greatest acts of organised resistance ever carried out by prisoners of war. It had preserved discipline, maintained military order, and above all, protected hope. The legacy of that network spread far beyond the prison. Military academies studied it. Survival instructors taught it. Even NASA astronauts learned its rhythm as a method of communication in case of isolation. It became a symbol, proof that even in captivity, the human spirit could adapt, evolve, and overcome. Many of the men who lived through those years later spoke of the silence that followed them home. They struggled to sleep without the tapping, without the faint rhythm that had once meant connection. Some missed it, that quiet pulse of life that had linked them through fear and pain. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, some of those men would stand before the black granite wall and rest their hands against it, feeling the cold stone beneath their fingers. Sometimes one would tap, soft, slow, rhythmic. Another veteran standing nearby would answer, just as they had decades before. Alive. Together. Still here. That was the message that had carried them through years of captivity, and it still carried them now. The tap code had been born in darkness, but its sound had outlasted the war. It proved that courage doesn't always roar, that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, rhythmic, and unbreakable. Inside the walls of the Hanoi Hilton, the enemy had tried to destroy the will of their captives. Instead, they had taught them the power of unity, the sound of resistance that no prison could contain. And though the prison stands silent today, if you listen closely enough, Past the rusted bars and faded walls, you can almost hear it still. A faint rhythm echoing through time. The sound of men who refuse to be broken. The sound of freedom. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I always read what you think. Hit like if you learned something new, and subscribe so you don't miss the next untold story of war, courage and survival. Turn on the bell for more history brought to life. See you in the next one.